Welcome back to another endgame strategy video. So today I want to talk about 2 versus 1 pawn endgames, and as you know I'm trying to get better in the endgame, and therefore I'm looking through my old games and trying to find endgames where I made some mistakes and where you can basically learn something from the mistakes. And I found quite an old game where I still had 1025 elo against an 1881 elo. So the game itself, especially middle game, is not that high quality, and the end game is full of mistakes. But I think it's an interesting one to cover because, yeah, you can learn a lot from the mistakes. It was a 2 versus 1 pawn end game, and I quickly want to show you the game. I'm playing with the black pieces, and my opponent opened with this double pawn Danish gambit, which we've also covered quite extensively on the channel. And basically, he did not manage to actually equalize. I'm going to give you the engine quickly. But black is actually better here in the middle game, but he somehow managed to get compensation, or rather, I somehow blundered 2 pawns in the end game here. It's still 2 pawns up, a rook take, a rook trade. The interesting thing happens after. Here it's still basically better for black. I somehow managed to here blunder completely. And basically here everything gets traded off, and we reach this position that I want to talk about, which is a dead draw, and you should, with both colors in this position, you should be able to hold this very easily as a draw. But somehow my opponent, I don't know, he wanted a little bit much. He played on. I played f5, king g3, king g7. It's still a dead draw. And here he risks a little bit too much. I think it's still equal. He sacrifices this pawn, which is, I think, unnecessary. And he activates his king, which is okay. Rook takes. Now I'm up a pawn. g4. He trades off 1 pawn, and I give a check. Rook d7 check. King g8. And I think the most reasonable way here, with white being down a pawn, is just rook d8 check. Constantly just checking me. You're down a pawn, you can't play for a win in this position. So this would have been, I think, the best approach. He played king h4, which is still a draw. I play h6. Rook d6 attacking the pawns. King g7. And again, you can go for a repetition here, but he played on. King attacks rook. Rook moves. King attacks rook again. Rook moves back, offering a rook trade. He says no. Offering a rook trade. Rook trade. And it's still equal in this position. If you play, and this is the correct approach, king f4 is the correct way to play this with white, and this holds the draw. If you look at a little bit like the possible moves for black, if you play g5 check, then just opposition, and if you move, he just goes back. If you move back, he just goes back. And if you try to approach at some point, he just has opposition. So you go to the side, he just has opposition. So there is no real way to actually win this position with black, even though you're up a pawn. But the problem in this position is that you have a backwards pawn that can never really be pushed. Otherwise, he just takes and walks through himself. So this is a little bit nasty. So an alternative for black in this position would be to approach with the king. But now a very nice technique that you can remember for your own games if you're down a pawn in such a position where you can give a check and trade off one of the pawns, you can actually sacrifice the pawn with g5 check here. He has to take with the h-pawn, and now king g4, you just block the pawn. And now basically black is in Zugzwang. You need to defend the pawn, but you really can't, and you have no other moves. You need to move back. And now I just take the pawn. Now you can defend the other pawn, but this is a draw. You just block this pawn endgame with king, and pawn against king is a draw. We're gonna see later on in the video as well how we can do this if you haven't seen it. He just always blocks the pawn, and you can't really make progress with black because he's just sticking to the pawn. So basically a draw again. After king f4, if you can try something else like king e6, but then just opposition. If you try to trade off the pawn, trade, and the king just rushes into the h1 corner, and this is a draw. You can't win with a rook pawn against a king. It's also a theoretical draw. And so basically, king f4 would have been the cleanest way to hold a draw with white here. But my opponent here chose king h4, which leaves me again with a couple of different possibilities. But this is now winning for black. If you want to find, there are 4 of these blunders, which are the difference between winning and drawing in this analysis. So if you always want to pause the blunders and find out how you can punish that, feel free to do so. So I've indicated with arrows what I think the most reasonable moves for black are, and let's go through them quickly. And so the first one I thought was g5 check, which I think is interesting because now a very nice defensive idea comes into play. King h5 and king h7. So white managed successfully to stalemate himself and hold the draw despite being down a pawn. So the correct way to win this game with black in this position is actually king e6. And he doesn't really have a very nice response to that. If he, for instance, tries g5, trading off the pawn, you just walk. And then you can just slowly but surely win the other pawn and then win the game. Maybe he has other alternatives, maybe he could go back, but then you just approach with the king, you don't trade off the pawns. At some point you give a check, and then you either when he gives a check, you go back, and then you just out-tempo him again with opposition, win the pawn, and 2-pawn endgame is simply won. And after g5, he could also be a little bit sneaky. Instead of going back, he could attack your pawn chain, but then you just win his pawn, and then the pawn marches, and your queen, and it's gonna be pretty much over very soon. So these are the alternatives that he has, basically going back or pushing, which both lead to a win for black. So king e6, a nice win for black here, but obviously I didn't find this move. I thought the most natural one is actually king f6, which would have blundered again the game to the tactic that we have already seen before, g5 sacrificing the pawn, h takes g5, king g4 Zugzwang situation, I need to go back, he wins the pawn, and this is what we've already seen before. You can't win this with black despite being up a pawn. So interesting that he didn't see this. Instead of this very nice g5 check, he played king g3 back, which again wins the game for black. And again, I didn't find this win. King g5 approaching and going into the opposition is the correct play. King f3, now you go again, opposition always attacking the enemy pawn. King f4, g5 check, forcing him back. He again defends the pawn, but now opposition again. He is shielded away from his own pawn, he goes back, you win the pawn. And now for those of you who are wondering how you win this endgame with being up 2 pawns, I'm going to quickly show you one variation where you just approach with the king and the pawns. At some point he tries to stalemate himself, so don't blunder here and don't stalemate him, but rather you go away with the king. And then he attacks the pawn, you sacrifice one of the pawns and the other pawn is going to queen. So this was one of the alternatives, like variations that you can win the game. I think in retrospect, this is a move that you should be able to find here. But I played g5, which again leaves me with this very nasty backwards pawn. And this is now a draw again. And he managed to somehow hold this draw. It's not that simple, but if you know the technique, then it should be possible. You can also just approach here and then he has an opposition. But I decided to go back, trade off the pawn. And now again we have the same motive as before. You can't win this with black because he always goes back. Then you can check him. You made 1 rank progress. But at the end you can't really do much more than stalemating him. And that's how our game ended, in a draw. I think very nasty in retrospect that I was not able to win this game. Here, this is one of the possibilities where you can win this game. Again, not pushing the pawn. This is one of the lessons that I want to give you. If you have such a constellation, don't push the pawn. Wait for him to push and then you can advance. And you have an advanced defended passed pawn, which is basically winning. And if he doesn't push, you have a very nice barrier here where he can't really enter. So you just go around with the king instead of just going into a check. Also, I think a very nice technique if you go here, then this one with just going into Zugzwang, blocking both of black's pawns, and this is now a draw. So let's recap quickly all the possibilities where I could have won the game and blundered the draw. King h4, this position. King f4. King h4. This position wins with king a7, a6. Just walking around the pawn chain, not pushing the pawns, just walking around. Then this position is also interesting now that he's basically vacated all the squares in front of the pawns. You can easily just walk in here and shield your own pawns and attack the enemy pawn. At some point you're gonna win it, and then it's a one end game. Also, props to my opponent who managed to know like how to hold at least this position a draw here with this nice king and pawn against king endgame, which is a draw here. So I hope you learned something from endgame theory in this video. I certainly learned something from my own mistakes. I think nowadays I will play this a little bit differently and consider the techniques behind it, like walking around, not pushing the pawns, just wait for him to make something, because basically you can just out-tempo him at some point because you've got two pawns, he's got one pawn. So keep that in mind maybe. And I hope you like these endgame series and you learned something from it. Write into the comments what you would like to see on the channel. Endgame, middle game strategy, opening theory, whole game analysis, more puzzles. Check out my Twitch and my Instagram, and see you in the next video. Bye.